What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video from the 10-7 MMA channel. We got a big story. God, this website is horrible with all these ads. I apologize. Let me keep closing and stuff. But the main point is that Ariel Helwani texted earlier today, April 9th, that GFL has canceled its first two events scheduled for May 24th and May 25th in Los Angeles, which I was considering going to, by the way, per multiple sources and confirmed by CSAC Executive Director Andy Foster. There's serious doubts about the future of the promotion. Reached out to founder Darren Owen, but no reply at this time. Okay. So that is it. That is the news that apparently this event has been canceled. But moreover, the promotion is in major trouble. So I want to talk about this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I made a video a long time ago why I felt that the GFL was not going to be successful. So it's me gloating. No, not really. I am actually quite bummed because I really wanted to see that Tony Ferguson, Dylan Dennis fight. And there were a couple other fights that were intriguing or interesting to me. So I like the idea of some of the fights. Most of them I wasn't super crazy, super thrilled about. I know Uriah Faber recently talked about having a fight scheduled, and that would have been exciting. So it's really unfortunate for the fighters that had fights and that had contracts and paydays, and they were supposed to get a larger percentage of the revenue and all this stuff, which sounded like a pipe dream. Turns out it was a pipe dream. So I do want to talk about this a little bit in terms of the sport as a whole and why I actually think this is a positive for the sport. Now, first, let's backtrack to why I initially said I believe this was going to fail. So the thing that this league was trying to do, at least purportedly, was try to be legitimate competition to the UFC, yet the issue that I had with them from the get-go, and is kind of the same thing with Bellator back in the day, is that all they were doing was leeching off of the hype and the fame already built and established by the UFC marketing machine. They weren't doing anything new or special or unique. They weren't trying to build stars. They were basically just trying to leech off of the already established fighters, leech off their fame and notoriety, and use that to help promote the fights and build the promotion. That's kind of how I felt. It didn't seem like they had a long-term plan of taking on young prospects and trying to build them up. And that's really the massive strength of the UFC, is they create a place and a platform and a marketplace where we can get to know up and coming fighters. Like, well, Ian Gary is really out of the prospect realm, but we got to see Ian Gary come into the mix as a young prospect and get to know him early and watch him through that journey. Paddy Pimblett's another guy we watched from the beginning and come up the ranks and really get excited about him. And as new guys come into the promotion, we learn about them, get to know about them, and get excited about them. And the UFC does this beautifully on their own, but also with their entire network of journalists and other news organizations. And I just didn't see how anybody was going to compete with that. Moreover, I didn't see the point to competing with it. Instead, what makes way more sense to me is trying to start a feeder organization, something like Fusion Fight League, which is a promotion that I work for, where it's a platform in place for amateurs or professionals early in their career to build themselves up so they can eventually enter the UFC with experience. And those types of promotions made sense. Why are you competing with the UFC when you have no foundation? You have no means by which to build fighters from nothing into superstars. That's what these organizations, I felt like, lacked from the beginning. So I never thought that they were going to be sustainable in the long run. I did think they were going to at least last for a year or two and have some fun events and probably lose money, try to raise more money. It would fail, and then eventually they'd go out of business. I'm very shocked that with all the money they spent on the draft and those graphics and getting the team together and calling out and giving contracts to all these guys, I'm pretty shocked actually that it exploded this quickly. I thought at a minimum that event that was scheduled was going to happen, but I guess it fell apart. I guess it was worse off than we even thought. But I think in the end, in the long term, this is better for the sport. And I want to explain why. I know people talk about the fact that when you don't have competition, you have less ability to leverage offers and negotiate with organizations like the UFC. This sport is in a different spot. Now, I haven't done a full business analysis of the entire sport as a whole, but when people try to compare, I'm going to do that one day. I want to actually dig into the numbers because I feel like people slander the UFC all the time without proper information. And without proper context of what exactly is going on and what are the moving pieces and parts and expenses and costs and all these other things that they have to deal with when they're trying to also negotiate with fighters and pay them out. They're always saying it's unfair because they just look at like revenue numbers and the percentage of the revenue is less than other organizations, but you can't compare it, in my opinion. And like I said, more deep financial analysis with some colleagues of mine is on the way, and I want to do that and really dig into the numbers. But from my standpoint, what I'm looking at is if you compare it to football or basketball or soccer, those sports are globally established. Kids are growing up playing those sports. They are lifetime fans, already watching football as kids growing up in those environments, and you've got fans just being created on a regular basis. MMA is in a different spot. It's still growing, and as popular as it may seem to us fans, it's still a fledgling sport. So the difference between those sports and maybe having other options versus the UFC is the UFC, the organization on its own, is building the sport. And I believe that means that they have way higher marketing expenses, equipment expenses. They're trying to build performance institutes globally, UFC gyms, etc., all across the world to increase the fan base. I guarantee you they're doing some sort of low level. And I would imagine there's some sort of investment going on into wrestling programs or MMA programs, trying to get it into schools, colleges, etc., because that's also how you build and then sustain a fan base. As kids getting into MMA at 4, 5, and 6, they're going to go and watch professionals compete in the sport. And then you have instant lifelong fans that will be built in without any additional marketing to the crowd. They're just going to be growing up watching it because they're competing in it. So my point is that the UFC has a lot of costs and overhead because they're still in development and still building the sport out globally. As such, I actually think long term, to maximize fighter pay, and again, this is just a theory which needs to be really substantiated with proper evidence and research and due diligence, which I will do. But I'm just saying that, at least from a logical standpoint, you can see what I'm trying to say is that the UFC right now, because of all these expenditures and overhead, I actually think it's better off without competition, because then they don't have people trying to raise the price of the fighters, reducing their budgets for marketing and all these other strategies that in the long term, I believe, will raise the entire tide, which will raise the overall salaries for everybody. Think about it like this. If the UFC had crazy competition at the beginning and they were really having to push up the salaries or the fight contracts up to the brim when they were already struggling financially, they may not have made it out of those early years when they were having some difficulties. But because, and they did have competitors crop up, but you can just imagine that the greater the competition, it's going to limit their ability to push the sport. And one thing we can say about the UFC is they're approaching this as a business. They're not trying to just take a big payday and bounce. They want to build this sport and keep adding on to it being the most entertaining sport on the planet and having bigger and better shows. Look at what they did at the Sphere last year. So I think that the fact that this supposed competitor in the GFL, which I never thought it was going to be competition for the UFC anyways, but I actually think that it going away is a net positive in the long term. Because once again, imagine if the UFC had paid larger amounts back in the day, they would have had less of a budget to create the TV show, to do all these other things, to sustain and build the sport to where it's at today. Where as much as people complain about it, the superstars are getting multi-million-dollar contracts. Back in the day where they were getting like 20, 30,000 to fight, even less at the inception. So it has come a tremendous way. And I know people want to be negative Nancy's all the time about fighter pay and this and that, but you have to appreciate the fact that this has become a place not only where fighters can get superstardom and global fame, but they can actually make quite a lot of money. It may not be yet at the level of the superstar boxers, but I think it's going to get there. And I think eventually it'll surpass it. And we're going to see amazing contracts, I hope, just like we have in football, basketball, and soccer. Obviously, there are people at the top of the sport that are making even more than a lot of those superstar athletes. But I think across the board, for even entry-level fighters, hopefully one day we'll see higher paydays. And I don't think of the UFC as the big bad guy who just wants to suppress the amount of money that all the fighters make. I actually think they want the fighters to win. They're part of the team, just like the executives, just like the staff. They want to pay everybody more. It's one big team, one big family. This is just my 2 cents and my perspective from the outside. I don't think it's necessarily a contentious relationship, but I think eventually they'd love to see everybody win. So that's my 2 cents. That's my takeaway on this news. But the bottom line is it looks like the GFL is sunk before it ever took off. the biggest bummer is no Tony Ferguson versus Dylan Dennis. Let's bring them both back into the UFC for that fight. That would be the one fight that they should actually take hold of, or get it in the PFL or something. That fight should happen. That was a great fight. Anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you agree with anything I've said? Do you disagree with everything I've said? Would love to hear all the feedback. Make sure to like this video if you did like it, and click subscribe if you want to see more from the 10-7 MMA channel. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.